Looks like his gravestone. Looks like his gravestone.
This is the tomb of Woodrow Wilson. Does anybody know what war he was our president during? No, it was before that. It was actually World War I. He was our president. He was our president. That would be kind of 1914 to 1917 is World War I. But he worked very hard for peace. For one thing, he tried to keep us out of World War I. He said the United States is going to be neutral. This is a war in Europe. We're not going to get involved. Unfortunately, we did need to get involved in 1917, but it's kind of a good thing we did because we went over and we really helped, defeat the Germans who were trying to invade our allies, France and England. But he also, after that war, and it was a very difficult war, especially in Europe, many people lost their lives. He tried to establish the League of Nations, considered the precursor to the United Nations, a place where countries could talk out their conflicts instead of engaging in war. So he is buried here. One thing interesting is the seal of the presidency. When Wilson was our president, the head of the eagle faced the arrows on the left talon, representing war, rather than the olive branch representing peace. Around the time of the Truman administration, after World War II, the head of the eagle flipped. Now it looks towards the olive branch, looking towards peace. Any questions about Wilson? We're going to go on to the high altar.
Yes. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. 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 I'm not loving it.
Don't step on the cracks.
Or you step on the crack, you'll break your mama's back. Step on the line, you'll break your father's spine. Hey. Oh. 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 Oh.
Let me ask you guys to squeeze in here.
Squeeze.
Yeah, I know when I get to stand up. So Washington National Cathedral, like a lot of Christian institutions, is built in the shape of a cross. We were seated in the nave. These are the transepts. This is the north transept. This is the south transept. And you could be in any cathedral in the world. You would be in the south transept if you were standing in this part of the church, because they're all built on an east-west axis. Beyond that is the choir chancel area, the high altar, and the apse, and we'll visit there later. So you see here at the crossing, if you were here on a regular Sunday, the altar would be right here, and there'd be risers for the choir behind it, and all the action would take place out here. You were here when the president was here. He would be seated in the front row on the aisle. President Obama has been here on 4 occasions. Both of those inaugural prayer services I mentioned. He also gave the eulogy from that lectern at the funeral for Dorothy Height, an important civil rights leader who passed away in his first term. And he led Mrs. Inouye up the aisle at the funeral of Senator Inouye, a long-standing U.S. senator from the state of Hawaii who passed away in the last year or so. George W. Bush gave the eulogy at President Ford's funeral from that lectern. In front of you, you see where preaching is done. It's called the Canterbury pulpit. It's called the Canterbury pulpit because the stone from which it was carved used to be in the bell tower at Canterbury Abbey in England. As an Episcopal church, we are a part of the Anglican Communion, and this is a connection to England. Also, it was a gift to the cathedral from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Most of the, most of the carvings you see relate to the translation of the Bible into English from Latin, but there's a historical scene on the front. Does anybody know what, we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of this event this year. That means it happened in the year 1215 in England. There's a king. Does anybody know what's going on? Martin Luther King preached from here. His name was King John, and it was the signing of the Magna Carta. So why is the signing of the Magna Carta on the place where preaching is done here at the cathedral? So you have the king there signing. You have the barons of Runnymede. They were the knights, the landowners. They were the ones who were saying to the king, you don't get all the power. We need laws that regulate the power of the throne. And then you've got a guy here holding a cross and wearing a pointy hat called a bishop's mitre. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Stephen Langton. But the Magna Carta, we have a copy of it in the National Archives. I don't know if you all are going to, that's part of your trip. But because it forms the basis of our Constitution. During the early days of the American Revolution, during the Boston Tea Party days and the Stamp Act days, our colonists, they kind of shook the Magna Carta at the throne and they said, we are not governed by the whims of a king, we are governed by the rule of law. And so that's why it's here, because it's an important part of our history. We like to think of this pulpit as a place where truth is spoken to power in the nation's capital. Many famous people have preached from here. Archbishop Desmond Tutu preached from this pulpit. We welcome people of all faiths. The Dalai Lama has taught from this pulpit. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. preached from this pulpit 4 days before his assassination. It was his last Sunday sermon. It was a Palm Sunday. So when Dr. King preached from this pulpit, this cathedral wasn't finished. That was 1968. It would have been finished just past Wilson's tomb where we stood, but there was still worship being held here, even though they were still building it out that way. 2 more rows of windows. I mentioned it is a Last Judgment theme. That's the Last Judgment window. You can see the gates of heaven at the 12 o'clock spot, the fires of hell at the 6 o'clock spot. This rose window is called the Church Triumphant. That's God the Father in the center holding the Lamb representing Christ. It's hard to imagine how big these are. Imagine yourself up on that balcony. But that figure of God, he's seated, but if he stood up, he'd be a 6-foot-tall man. Look how big the columns are here at the crossing. They're much thicker here than they are down the main church because they're holding up the bell tower that rises about 300 feet above us. It's the highest point in Washington, D.C., not because it's about 300 feet tall, and the Washington Monument's 555 feet tall, but we're on higher ground. So, we are the highest point. There's a carillon played on a keyboard, and there are 10 peal bells that are rung as they would have been rung in the Middle Ages. Do I have any Harry Potter fans here? Harry Potter fans?
I hate
them. Harry Potter fans. You getting a little Hogwarts off this building? Yeah. Well, you climb that tower, you really feel like you're at Hogwarts because there's 333 steps up. There's all these staircases. There's old wine bottles left by the stone carvers. You get a beautiful view of the city. Any questions about the crossing? We're going to move on to War Memorial Chapel.
Yeah, finally, we're moving. What? I hate you. Light a candle.
So when the founders of the cathedral, can you guys squeeze in a little bit more? That'd be great. When the founders of the cathedral were planning the various chapels, and there are 9 chapels here, they didn't have a plan for a chapel here in the South Transept. But following World War II and the great loss of life, they wanted a chapel in honor of the men and women of the armed services. So this chapel was created under the theme of the ultimate sacrifice. The idea being, in our national story, the men and women of the armed services make the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. And in the Christian story, Christ makes the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. So just a couple of things in here. See this simple stone cross? That's actually from the remains of the Pentagon following the attacks of 9/11. was a gift to the cathedral from the Army chaplains of the Pentagon. I'm just going to point out a few